everyone. My name is Jason Peters. I'm Managing Director of the Payments Practice here at Tevora. We're going to go ahead and get the webinar started. For those new to Tevora who have never worked with us, go ahead and give you a little background. Tevora is a specialized management consultancy focused on cybersecurity, risk and compliance services. From our offices in California, New York, and Virginia, we serve national and international companies, institutions, and governments. Today, I'm going to be providing a presentation on transitioning employees and call center agents to work remotely in a PCI compliant manner. This is something that's come up several times, especially given the current pandemic and a lot of the organizations transitioning to remote work or work from home policy. So today's agenda, real quick, we're going to talk about a path to developing a remote work strategy. But what does that look like? How do we actually get to a place where we can work remotely in a compliant manner? And how do we maintain compliance as we work through these difficult times? PCI relevant items to consider. So I'll list out some of the requirements. There's quite a few that deal specifically with remote work. And then additionally, excuse me, I'll touch on some topics that the SSC has provided guidance for. And then finally, monitoring and maintaining a compliant remote strategy. It's not enough just to put the policies and the pieces in place. How do we maintain that compliance as we move forward? So let's jump in. Path to developing a remote work strategy. This path is it's high level in the sense that, it's going to be very flexible to fit most organizations. Strategies and their current policies and procedures. So the first thing that, we're going to talk about is you got to assess the risk. Utilizing your current risk assessment process, how are you going to be able to allow people to work remotely? How are you going to extend your network? You need to go and perform a risk assessment so that as an organization, you can best accept and understand the challenges of working outside of your current physical location. Taking that risk assessment and really developing, as many strategies to conform to PCI compliance, but also to conform to your organization's appetite for risk is going to, best serve you in the long run. So really start off with that risk assessment. Once you've done the risk assessment, you've documented your perceived risks and the challenges that you're going to be facing. You really want to document your strategy. And it's really in three areas: your policies and procedures. Make sure that if you don't currently have remote work policies and procedures, it's going to be key that you get some in place and understand what that's going to look like. Training material. So the PCI DSS does call on organizations to train their employees on how to handle credit card data, how to handle private and secure cardholder data. So you really got to make sure that you're addressing not just the secure handling, but how that secure handling is going to look like when you have people working remotely. And then finally, controls testing and review. How are you going to go and implement these different controls that are going to be new to the organization, new to your employees, but more so, how are you going to actually test them and ensure they're in place, and how are you going to review them? So you really need to, create a foundation of these documents. Educate leadership. So once you get everything that you feel is relevant, documented, bring it back to leadership and make sure that they understand the risk. Here's your strategies. Here's the education material that you're going to be putting out there. Here's how we're going to keep our employees working during these challenging times. And more importantly, here's everything that we're going to use to ensure that we're still operating in a compliant manner, even though we're faced with these challenges. Next, you want to educate the employees. And we're going to kind of harp on this one a lot because You really want to go back and make sure that they understand, hey, you might be working somewhere else, but our same um, policies, procedures, requirements, they're still in place. You still have to maintain secure workloads. You still have to maintain, um, you know, not copying down credit card numbers, not writing information down, securing the data. And we'll talk about some of the physical security aspects, some of the guidance the SSCs provided, and I'll kind of give you my opinions on that. But you really want to make sure the employees are ready to work from home. Next, you want to extend your current controls. So what are we talking about here? We're really talking about everything from your vulnerability management program, your patching, your scanning, your evaluation, your evaluation of threats, your firewall rule reviews, ensuring that the controls that are being pushed out to these extensions of your environment, that they're following the same thing in a vulnerability management program. You want to ensure the functionality of remote agent-based solutions. So ensure that your antivirus, if it's calling back home to a centralized server, then it's able to do so, even remotely. If you're using some sort of data loss prevention or data loss protection solution to supplement your controls, you want to make sure that those are functioning appropriately. And then finally, your access control and authentication. There's so many things when I get into the PCI DSS requirements. They're going to harp back on authentication and authorization, that you really got to make sure that all those things are functioning correctly and in a compliant manner. And then finally, you want to reassess the risk. So it's not just enough that you did one risk assessment. As you go through these times, as things change, as the controls are matured, you really want to make sure that you're going back and you're saying, what are the true risks? So you start off with the initial risk assessment, develop your policies and procedures, educate. So you're going to educate your leadership, educate your employees. And then extending your controls is probably one of the biggest challenges I've seen from organizations. And a lot of the questions I've had is, how do we appropriately extend these controls? And then finally, reassess the risk. Continually go back and, are these risks being addressed by our organization? Are there new risks and new challenges? Do we need to go back and, re-educate or re-document some things or change our documentation? So PCI relevant items to consider. I tried not to beat you up. I didn't embed them in the PowerPoint because I don't want to do a death by PowerPoint here. I'll go over the requirements here, but there are so many that are relevant here. But there's three key areas that we want to talk about when we talk about PCI relevant items. Your administrative access to your PCI relevant environments, so your cardholder data environment. Your solutions. So they might not be in the cardholder data environment, but these are the solutions that are providing security for your cardholder data environment. These are the solutions that are connected to your cardholder data environment. How are we accessing them? The technologies that are driving your business. How are they storing, processing, transmitting? How are people accessing those? How are they able to connect, manage, and maintain those technologies? And finally, the data. We have this cardholder data. We've been entrusted with it. We're required through regulations and the PCI DSS to protect it. How are people accessing their data? User access. So beyond administrative access, just our regular user access to cardholder data. And as I pull out some of these DSS requirements here in a second, you'll see there's a lot, and there's some moving parts that should be considered. Then monitoring, reviewing, and controlling access. So that's one of the biggest things: monitoring, reviewing, and controlling access. When we look at the PCI DSS, and I didn't pull every requirement out, but these are the ones that should be kind of top of mind as we talk about remote access or remote workers. Is requirements 2.3 on encrypting non-console administrative access. So when we talk about this, we're really talking about ensuring that you have a way to protect the authentication of the user that's going to be performing the administrative access, and that the information being sent back and forth between the remote node and the technology or solution in place is secured in a way that meets the current PCI DSS guidelines. Obviously, we're not talking about old versions of SSH or earlier versions of TLS or SSL. You really want to make sure that you're following those encrypted non-console access communications under 2.3. And then when we get into requirement 8, things like 8.1.3 immediately revoke access of terminated users. Business is still going to continue. We're still going to have employees that leave the organization. And as that occurs, we need to make sure that we're monitoring and revoking that access. The same workflows that you had previously for termination should still be able to function in some form. And you want to make sure that you're really grabbing onto those processes and controlling how those users' access is being terminated. 8.1.5, when we talk about managing IDs used by third parties. The third parties right now, we're seeing a lot of organizations where having to rely on our service providers to supplement our environments, and some organizations where they've had to go to a more heavy-handed approach with their service providers, where the service providers are coming in and doing staff augmentation, they're supplementing the environment. Ensure that you're managing those user IDs. 8.3, access of non-console remote access to the CD has to use MFA. Multi-factor authentication is going to be one that's going to be harped on. The SSC is coming out with some additional guidance on MFA specific to the current environment and working remotely. 8.3.2 specifically MFA for all remote access originating outside the corporate network. So as these users, your agents, your administrative staff, your technologists, as they're going through and they are accessing the network, they're now should be required to use MFA so that you can ensure the validity of that access request. What I'm going to touch on is 8.5.1. It's a requirement specific to service providers, but as a merchant or a service provider using other service providers, you need to make sure that that they're using unique credentials whenever they're accessing your environment. The more that we're allowing people in, the more that we're accessing other people's environments, we need to make sure that we have a way to track unique credentials. The easiest way is typically on the organization allowing people to connect to them is enforce your authentication schemes, your Active Directory or another Active Directory instance for these people. And then when we get into the policies and procedures, the 12.3 usage policies for critical technologies, it goes further down into 12.3.8 where it talks about automatically disconnecting sessions for remote access. I've had a lot of questions on this. It's painful, right? We have people that are working remotely. We have people that are trying to do the best they can. How do we make sure that they're able to work efficiently, but we're not allowing them to just have these stale sessions where they're granted access for extended periods of time. So you really need to monitor that and just make sure that we're cutting off those sessions after they've gone stale. In 12.3.9, it talks about activation of remote sessions only when needed. And here we're talking about remote sessions for service providers or third parties. And they need to access the environment and they need to provide support. It's not always fun, but you need to make sure that they're not on unless they have to be on. And then under 12.3.10, the biggest thing is when we have these people working remotely, the prohibition of copying, moving, and storage of cardholder data onto the local drive. This one is one that I'm going to harp on a lot because, we need to make sure that we're not getting into a data proliferation scenario where people are copying information, they're pulling it down, they're, they need it to do their work, and it's not malicious. They just, I need this data. The challenge is now what's the end result? You have data out on these different remote nodes, laptops, maybe it's being given a corporate desktop, and now it's just sitting out there in an environment that you don't have a lot of control over. One thing I'll talk about is the SSC guidance that's come up. They put out a blog post, and it is very brief. It talks about kind of the people, process, technology perspective on the current pandemic and working remotely. And the keys that the key items that they kind of put in there that I thought were relevant today were require only corporate supplied devices. So no BYOD, don't bring your own device to this scenario, because the amount of control you're going to have over that device is going to be limited. They talk about patching, AV being up to date, your host-based firewall, and then administrative access to the local host. So it's tough and it's challenging to support these environments when people are working remote. But allowing your users to have administrative access to these machines, or local admin, is just going to create more problems. And then you're going to have scenarios where something gets in the way and they're going to turn it off. Antivirus gets in the way, they turn it off. DLP, whatever it is, the perceived problem is, they're going to disable it because they have that access. The other item they talk about is the extension of the network. And now people are on their home network, and they talk about the security of the home network and ensuring that the security of the home network would meet or at least be close to the corporate policy. That one is a challenge. It's guidance from the SSC, and I'm not saying it's bad guidance. I'm saying it's a challenge, because how do we enforce that? How do we even test that? Do we get employees to authorize us to scan their network? It's definitely something that has been brought up, and I've talked with clients about. If it's something that's in your policies and procedures, it really goes back to your risk assessment. What is the perceived risk? Are you able to? Do you have the licensing to actually scan all of these environments? Do you have the time to run these scans over these remote connections? So there's a lot to be weighed out there. And again, this is just SSC guidance. It's not a requirement. And then the last item they talk about is the physical security of printed data. Now, if there is a scenario where you have employees that have to handle printed data, and this isn't a far-fetched concept, people were handling printed data in their office space. If they're continuing to work, are we shipping them printed data, etc.? The biggest part here is the physical security concern. If you're shipping the data, you need to do it via some sort of secure method, or at least a method to track it, through tracking numbers, etc., through reputable shipping agents. And then the requirement for the employees to secure the data when they're not working with it. They have to have a means to physically secure it. As I talk through this, and as I've talked through with other organizations, the challenges really become obvious when it comes to the printed data and physical data. There's no true way to enforce it. We can put policies and procedures, but how do we test it? We're not going to people's homes to see if they're using a lockbox, even if it's provided by the organization. My number one recommendation here would be prohibit the use of physical data. And then in lieu of that, if you're not able to prohibit it, come up with the best strategy and really work with your employees to figure out the best way to deal with that data. And those are really the items that PCI SSC has specifically called out, and those are the areas they're concerned with. We can provide you with a link to that blog post after this presentation. But those are the key items right now from a PCI DSS and from an SST relevant perspective. I didn't want to sit here and just read you the DSS and a bunch of requirements, although I kind of did for a little bit. The biggest thing is when you do your risk assessment and you analyze these systems that you're going to put out there, there's a concept that the PCI SSD introduced in some of their scoping guidance, which was the applicable controls or applicable requirements. What are the applicable requirements, when you deal with these systems? The SSE called out a couple, patching, antivirus, your host-based firewalls, and your non-local administration. I would say it really comes down to, systems hardening, which your organizations are already doing. If you're providing them, which you should be, and then with a corporate device, it should already be hardened. So a lot of these are going to take care of themselves. The biggest thing is going back and testing and making sure that everything is still working when it's not connected to the corporate network on a continual basis. So monitoring and maintaining a compliance strategy. Well, there's a couple of key concepts here. Ensure that logs generated by remote users are being aggregated and reviewed or monitored. This is one where it becomes a struggle, but it's the where is enough, right? Where do I have enough logs? Where do I have enough information? There's going to go back to your risk assessment. Make sure that you're including your log aggregation. Now, if you're not currently enabling logging on all of these desktops, and you're going to enable it now, what's the cost associated with that? Especially if you're working with a SIM that's on a EPS or events per second licensing, you're going to see that go way up. So you have to keep that in mind. Are there other ways to do that? Are there other ways to review the log? And there are, and we'll get into that. Regularly monitor technologies for updates and patching. Again, your antivirus, your operating system, the applications running on these desktops. Those are the ones that usually fall through the cracks on your patching. Your Adobe's, your word processing technologies, making sure that those are being patched and maintained appropriately. And then one thing I'm going to talk about is utilize every opportunity to educate employees. You have a captive audience, which we're working on their computers. Things have changed. Adding in a couple communications or tagging on to updates from the CEO to say, hey, we love that everybody's working, they're doing a great job. Keep information security in mind. Just a couple quick blurbs about the importance of that will go a long way in ensuring that employees have the information they need, but additionally that you're able to kind of do your due diligence here and demonstrate that employees are being informed about what's important. So let's break these out a little bit more. So log generation, aggregation, monitoring. The logs are kind of speak for themselves, right? We want to aggregate the logs. We want to get them on. Take advantage of the SIM or the logging solution you have in place and try to automate as much review as you can. If you have the ability to do some safe searches and alerts, this is really the time to invest in that and get that put in place so you're not overwhelming your staff with manual reviews of logs. Where you're not able to aggregate logs, develop a sampling strategy that fits within your current risk appetite so that you're able to, manually go out and just look over a couple machines, make sure everything looks good, and you're able to get through a population in a reasonable amount of time. Depending on the solutions that you've deployed to your employees, you could script this, you could automate it. There's a number of ways to do so. If you're in Windows, you could use PowerShell to just, pull back logs from the remote systems, aggregate and analyze to look for any indicators of compromise. The other part is when we talk about the prohibition of copying or saving data to the local machine, going through the machines on a regular basis, even if you don't have a DLT, you can go through quickly with a script and just look at some files, typical log files, text files, even Word files with some of the different Python libraries that are available to look for any credit card data and then investigate further from there. But you want to do something, even if it's a manual review of a handful of people a week, where you're checking to ensure that there's no cardholder data being stored on the local devices. That's one of the biggest threats right now, is if they have it on the local device and they're already on their system and they disconnect from work, but I just wanted to look at a website or something, that system could be compromised and then you have a big exposure there. Updates and patches, the PCI DSS requires that you're subscribed and staying aware of the threats facing the technologies you have in the environment. So going out and just, being more regular, looking at things like the SANS risk reports that they're putting out, the newsletters, looking at Microsoft's website, what are the current threats facing the Windows deployments that we have. Having a good inventory of the applications that are on the systems out there. Being able to quickly identify, here are the threats that are facing the applications we've deployed for our users. And then again, educate, make sure you're getting education out there. So questions. So let me see if there's any questions here in the chat. Are there any questions? You can enter them into the chat via the GoToWebinar. I see maybe a couple are going to be coming in, but some of the things that I've been asked thus far is, what are the risks associated with having our employees remote? What are the big risks that we need to address or contemplate here? And I would say right now the biggest thing that I'm seeing based off of conversations with current clients is the risk of the data proliferation. I keep harping on it, but some of the things that we've seen out there, or some of the threats that we've seen, really come back to employees storing cardholder data on these systems and being able to quickly look at those and identify where you have cardholder data is going to be a key. Here's one of the questions that came in. How does virtual desktop technology reduce remote user control? That's a great question. So how can we leverage remote desktop, and so like a VDI environment, to either limit the number of applicable controls or help with the extension of the network? And there's really a couple things that can happen here. One is when you use some sort of remote desktop or VDI, virtual desktop, one of the things that you're going to see immediately is your control over their desktop environment, right, that they're connecting to. So you're going to get a lot of return on investment in that way. But how does it reduce the remote user controls? Well, it's not so much going to reduce the applicable controls for the remote user, but it's more so what it's going to do is it's going to allow you to have tighter controls over their access and your monitoring, and your requirement to go out and kind of test these machines is going to be limited. So a lot of the requirements around going out and inspecting machines, aggregating their logs, you're going to be able to get around that, because now you're going to have more control over the desktop they're using. You're going to be able to monitor that desktop a little bit more closely. So I'm not going to say that it's going to reduce the controls as much as it's going to reduce the overhead associated with maintaining the controls. I'm not sure that that's a good answer. If that doesn't answer your question, please let me know so I can go back and reword it. This is another good question. How does work at home and VoIP affect compliance? So anytime we have a VoIP technology where you're transmitting cardholder data, that technology should be in scope for PCI. It's transmitting cardholder data over the solution. Now, one of the things that the SSC put in their blog post was the requirement for MFA for users when they connect to the phone system. So if they're connecting to VoIP, they should be using MFA to do so. So how does work at home and VoIP affect compliance? You can extend the VoIP to those individuals so that they can continue to work. Call center agents, the employees. There's no prohibition against doing that. The biggest concern is that they're still authenticating in a secure manner. So they're using MFA, they're using their username and password, and that, you know, you're going to have to look at how they're connecting to VoIP and then the controls around that connection. So if it's not a persistent connection, it's say it's a VPN connection that these people are using, you know, the timeouts, etc., associated with it. Now, that's not to say that you should be cutting them off. Every 15 minutes, as an organization, you'll have to do the risk assessment to see what the appetite for the connection without activity would be. But being able to do so in a compliant manner, you can still be compliant. The biggest key right now that we're seeing in the industry and the SSC has put out there is that people are using MFA when they're connecting to these networks. I hope that answered your question. And I'll give it a few more seconds in case there's any other questions that want to come in. Again, I try not to beat everybody up with a lot of the PCI DSS requirements. You know, I really tried to call out the ones that were specific to remote. And there's a lot of questions out there right now. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out. You know, answering questions is not a big deal for us. Just send us the question. I'll be more than happy to answer it. I'm not going to try to strong arm you into a meeting. The biggest thing is if we can provide you with information to ensure that everybody that's transacting, everybody that's working in the PCI ecosystem is doing so in a secure and compliant manner, it's going to help everyone else out. So, with all that being said, we do have some other webinars coming up. Oh, here we go. Yeah, the PCI blog, we will send that out after this. We'll send that out to everybody who joined the call. I'll work with our team here to make sure that everybody gets that. We do have some upcoming webinars. I'll be speaking again on the 23rd about maintaining service provider compliance and impacts the pandemic can have. Hopefully I'll be feeling a little bit better by then. Additionally, we have some really interesting pen testing and cloud solutions that we're going to be discussing along with some healthcare specific items. But we will send out that PCI blog. It's very short and sweet. It's worth the read. They break out people, process, technology, and they don't go overly in depth into PCI requirements as much as just generalized topics of PCI compliance. So if there's no more questions, I want to thank everybody for their time. I hope I answered your questions. If you have questions or feedback, please feel free to reach out and let us know so that we can make the next one better. And I can get back to you if there's any follow-up or items that you'd like to know more about. So thanks, everyone, and I hope you have a good day and everybody stays healthy.